What's happening, people, and welcome to It's All Blakademik with me, Jordan, your host, and I have a fantastic, packed and high quality panel of guests for this week's show. I'm joined by Jay, Joel, Sia, Dane and Scarlett. How are we all doing, people?
Very well.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on this week's show. I want to talk this week, guys, about comedy. Everyone loves a bit of comedy, we love to laugh. But I want to ask you guys on the subject of comedy, if there is ever a line when it comes to comedy. Or if something makes you laugh, if something makes you tick, when it tickles you in a certain way, that negates any possible sensitivities about the topic the joke is about. I'm going to come to the comedian on the panel in just a moment. But before I do, Scarlett, what do you think? When it comes to comedy, is there ever a line for you?
Okay, so for me, I feel like people are just a bit too sensitive nowadays. And when it comes to comedy, as long as what's being said is true and you're going to laugh about it and kind of think, actually, yeah, that's right, then I don't feel like there's a line. I feel like you can just keep going. Yes, people do get offended, but if there's truth behind it, someone needs to say it. So if you're going to say it in a funny way, then yeah, so be it.
Even if that truth or that topic is about something that on a sensitive level, maybe I don't know, there's no real humour in that. If it's funny and it makes you laugh, it's kind of fair game.
For me, yeah.
You.
Does that make me a bad person?
Not at all. No, if you laugh, you laugh. Let me ask Dane. This is your world. This is your business.
Yeah.
As a comic, are there certain subjects? Is there an unwritten rule amongst other comics? There are just some areas you just don't go down that route.
Not necessarily. I think that there are some schools where people feel there are some taboo subjects, but I kind of agree with Scarlett. I don't think things are off limits. However, like the thing with truths are all based on perception. So, like there is a difference between truths and facts. Because I guess you want stuff to be backed up by facts if you're going to make an observation. But any statement you make, I don't think it's an issue about whether the line is about what you say, because offence is something that can be is taken, not given, so to speak. But it's more of a question of, if you're going to make a statement, then you have to be prepared to maybe defend that statement if it's going to move people emotionally, or just realise that there's going to be consequences to any of your actions, whether you do it on stage or not. So let's say, for example, if what you're saying, if you're validating a stereotype, and you might offend people in your audience, or that stereotype may be related to some kind of legislation. So for example, if you make a stereotype about black men, and then we're aware that black men get searched 6 times more often than anybody else, then you could be validating that outside of the stage.
Because it's true.
It's true, but it's not even something to say that it's true, but it's more the question, if you make a stereotype that kind of leads to people being treated a certain way, then you're almost like, you can be inciting oppression for somebody else. But I'd say rather more of a succinct way to put it is that I feel like you can say whatever you want as long as you're prepared to defend it. Because really most observations and jokes are always going to be at somebody's expense. So for a lot of people that do complain about freedom of speech, it's not so much that I feel a lot of people complain about freedom of speech. It's not the freedom of speech, it's more they want to speak without consequence, and that's not how the world works. No. So if you're going to say something like, if you insult someone's a loved one or a relative, then they might want to punch you in the face when you come off stage.
This is true.
So it's like, I think you've got to just consider that. I'm not saying that, by what you're saying, that words should always lead to something physical, but at the same time, we are aware that different aspects of art can elicit emotions and elicit certain actions. So I don't think comedy's any different.
Okay, Joel, what about for you? Is it all fair game if it makes you laugh, or are there certain things that you will not laugh at?
There might be things I won't laugh at, but that doesn't mean that the comic shouldn't embrace the topic. It's up to, I think a comedian should do what a comedian does, try to find the funny in whatever they think there's funny in.
So go on.
Yeah, so and from that point of view, they'll get regulated by the audience. So if they do say something funny and it doesn't go down well, they'll quickly know about it. So, but I don't think that should stop them from trying to be funny or broaching subjects. I mean, I was at a show the other day, comedian tried to make funny of the nerve agent incident that happened up in Manchester, or just outside Manchester. And one of the audience walked out, so obviously it was a close, intimate kind of venue. So everybody was like, ooh, do you know what I mean? He's obviously not found the funny in what everybody else found funny, and to kind of follow on what you're saying, truths and facts, you're right, perception. Because nobody knows it was the Russians. But this comedian saw fit to kind of blame the Russians, and he thought it was funny because that's what he's been told. So, I don't think that should stop comedians from broaching a subject, but you'll get regulated if it's not funny.
Sure. Jay, so the kind of what I'm getting from you guys is that while the comedian has the right to make jokes and material about whatever he or she wants to, if that is indeed the case, do you feel that there are some subjects that maybe shouldn't be like, well, off limits if they can find some skill or art in making content about that topic? So if I give you 3 examples. So could a good comedian find comedy value in the subject of rape?
I would like to see him try that. I think for me it's always going to be about, when it comes to sensitive issues or controversial issues, I think it's about what's the intent behind that joke, and where and actually who is the joke on. You know, is the joke on the woman? Because if there is, then yeah, I'm presuming the victim was a woman then, but it happens both ways. What I'm saying is the joke on the victim or is the joke on the perpetrator? No, there are so many, you know, variables. It would really depend. It's like, give me the joke and I'll tell you if it's funny. I mean, for me, I think the line would be around children. Anything about paedophilia or anything like that, I'd be like, there is no joke there for me.
It's funny you say that, Jay, because when I started doing comedy, like that was a very big point of for a lot of comics. When I was doing like mainstream gigs, where, and predominantly a lot of white comics, like talking about paedophilia was always a point that they felt for comedy. And I might not say it's funny.
Who was the joke on? Was it on the victim or was it on the perpetrator?
It would vary. It would vary.
Yeah.
Like, and it's trying to make like light of a very grave situation. But I think it's an important thing, like I said, for most people to know that with comedians, rather than, if you do hear something, for example, from a comic, and it is offensive or it does make light of like molestation, for example, I've seen there's issues where people try and get into like arguments when they're heckling comics. And I think the most important thing for people to learn is that if you want to get to a comic or you want them to feel what they said was wrong, don't laugh. Like having a back and forth, because people can use that, and it's still a response that it sounds like an elicited emotion. But I'd say a lot of time people do feel offended by comics. The best way to deal with them, because essentially at the root they're all seeking validation and recognition for it. Don't acknowledge them or don't laugh.
And that's what
they can learn very quickly. Like that joke's not going to work.
Sia, is there ever a joke that you've heard or a set or stand-up that you've heard and someone has said something and you have kind of laughed but then caught yourself and thought, well, hang on a minute, maybe I shouldn't be laughing about that?
Yeah, so I was at a show and the comic who this probably added to why I didn't find the joke funny or why I was somewhat offended, because he wasn't that funny, but he made a joke about Muslims in reference to terrorism. And like one of the ladies next to me, I'm not Muslim, but I still was like it was very, very, very fine line. I feel like with comedians, they have such a power because you tell a joke and in some way, what you're saying shapes minds. So it's funny. So we run with a certain rhetoric because it's funny. So for example, if you find, I don't know, if you compare Islam to, or just even put the two together, Islam and terrorism together, as a comedian, people laugh, but it reinforces stereotypes that already exist. So then people carry on running with that rhetoric, do you understand? So for me, I feel like things like rape, for me, that's off the card. To me, that's not funny. I don't feel like you can be, I don't know how funny, God would have to come down from heaven for you to make that, because that is something that impacts people's life. It changes their life. It has a long-standing effect on someone's life. So I don't feel like I don't feel like there's any way to make that funny. And I think that doesn't mean if I'm at a show and a comedian makes a joke about it, that I'll be like, oh my, do you know what I mean? Because I still understand that that's their line of work. And I still understand that other people may find that funny. And it also comes down to everybody's individual morals and values and what's important to me. I don't think a rape victim will find it funny because they've been subject to that, do you understand? Same way a Muslim person might not find that funny because they've been a victim of being accused of terrorism, do you understand? So I feel like it comes down to your individual morals and values. But for me, I feel like there is a fine line, and I feel like although we are in a hypersensitive society right now, I do feel like there needs to be boundaries somewhere along the line, because if there's not boundaries in something, you just keep going off on a tangent. And
but the thing is that it's who set those boundaries, because people have different principles, different values,
different
and so
moral
it's
compass.
like, who is the principal police? It's really hard because it's always shifting. You know, those jokes that were made about, you know, about Muslims and terrorism. 20 years ago it was Irish and terrorism. Do you know what I mean? It's just kind of the times, and so it's very fluid. And so it's very hard to then say, well, this is the line, because that line changes.
That's why I think that, as I said, like, I don't feel like it can be censored. Comedy can be censored, because what's offensive to you may not be offensive to me. But for me, I just feel like there is a line on certain things, and I just won't find them funny.
What if not a line? There's definitely responsibility. Which is why I just want to go back to me saying that, like, for example, if you are going to offend a particular group and you receive a backlash from that group, then you must be aware of that when you make that statement. Because I found with a lot of comics who are most outspoken about political correctness, like myself, I don't find this current zeitgeist of sensitivity or political correctness a problem, because I'm still going to say what the fuck I want, irrespective of how people react. So if someone's like, I find that offensive, I'll be like, I don't care. So, and I'll continue what I'm saying, because I know I don't write stuff I didn't write it with you, I don't know you, so I didn't write this with the intention of directly offending you. Yeah. And I'll always make that point that we didn't write this together, so.
And everyone's always going to take it differently, aren't they?
Everyone's
always going to offend
everyone's
someone.
Always, and sometimes if you're having social commentary, sometimes when people get offended by what I'm saying, I'm like, good, because I said it to offend you. So a lot of the time, there are situations where I'm saying stuff like, well, if I'm dealing with social commentary, this narrative is supposed to offend or mobilize or awaken a certain group of people. So that's why I say it. But the point I want to make is that when people talk about like, oh, my freedom of speech and blah, blah, I feel like that is a real romanticized idea. And when people are talking about freedom of speech, it's really more about their privilege. Because we have never really had a state where there's been freedom of speech. Because as far as I'm aware, if you spoke up against the government in apartheid, for example, you go to prison. Or with Elijah Muhammad, before he started the Nation of Islam, he was arrested and imprisoned for sedition. Martin Luther King, non-violent protester, he was put in prison. You have Ofcom, so you regulate what's said on TV. You have libel laws or slander laws, so if you say something that is erroneous in like a publication, you can be fined or you can be imprisoned or you can lose your business. So we've never really had a point whereby you've been able to say whatever you want anyway. There's always been some element of regulation in terms of what you say. And like I said, within just normal, as a social speech and social interaction, if you say something to offend someone and you verbally abuse or assault them, they might punch you in the face. So as far as I'm concerned, when people are like, I have freedom of speech, what they mean is, I want to be able to say what I want with no consequence.
So are we agreeing then that paedophilia against kids is probably the one thing that we wouldn't laugh at, and that's the one thing that you can't make funny? Or is I've got here a list of things, the Harvey Weinstein scandal, the Holocaust, Grenfell. Are these also in that bracket of things that you just cannot make funny?
Well, the thing is,
or is paedophilia kind of in its own
like
bracket?
And rape as well.
But we were discussing all that as a premise, though. So just saying Grenfell, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are making light of the victims. If you talk about Grenfell, you could very accurately put that. And even like, for example, like a rape joke, for me, it's like, just the word alone shouldn't trigger people into shutting down, because that's the premise. Because you could be talking, that word could be used to describe things other than you forcing yourself and sexually assaulting an innocent person. Or so rather than just saying this subject, leave it alone, I think there should be a lot more of a narrative.
Okay. I think any rape jokes?
No, none I can think of. But then,
would you?
Yeah. I think it's for me, no, because I can't think of a situation where I can make a rape joke funny. Okay. Right. So that's why I'd leave, because for my endeavour is to make a good joke, an original joke that I wrote myself that would be funny. So unless it would be like someone who's a rapist receiving reprisals for their actions, then like I said, unless you can make it funny, then I
okay. So Jay, tell me about some of the comics that you rate, some of the comics that you think kind of get to that line without crossing it, and they're very, very, because I think we all agree. Obviously,
no pressure, Jay.
Obviously, is an art. Who are the artists that you feel get to that line, but are very, very cute about how they kind of tread that line?
I mean, comedy also it takes a lot of intelligence to be a really good comic. You have to have, for me, you have to have real intelligence to be a comedian, to be a good comedian.
What happened?
But for me, like, there are lots of comedians out there, but for me, my favourite comedian of all time, hands down, has always been Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor is the only comedian that had me literally like holding my sides, can't breathe, tears running down my face because of how funny he was. And he said that you can say whatever you like when it comes to comedy, as long as it's funny. That was his line. Okay. And so he was able to do jokes about his heart attack. He was did jokes about him freebasing coke. He did jokes about his divorce. He did jokes about all kinds of things.
Ah,
Exactly,
so-
because they were
but-
on here.
Exactly.
But they were
Yeah.
his jokes.
Yeah.
They were
About his experience.
and his life.
He wasn't
so-
joking about divorce per se or heart attacks per
No,
se.
No, but he was talking about his actual heart attack and how it felt, and you felt it, but it was still funny. That's a skill. So I think it's down to comedian. It's down to the skill of the comedian. And that's the line. It's a skill of the comedian for me.
But I guess as well in that respect, it's okay because he is talking directly about himself. So you can't really I don't think you can get offended on that because it's like, oh, he's telling a story about himself. That's funny.
He also told jokes about growing up in a brothel and about the woman that ran the brothel and the women and the.
But again, that's
That's
his
his
experience.
experience.
His experience.
Yeah.
And it's true, which definitely works as well. So because he's given an honest account, then again, even if it was potentially offensive, that's him giving an anecdote about his own life. And it's like Scarlett was saying, it's about truth. So even when we discuss things like stereotypes or like this conflation of Muslims with terrorism, stuff like that, like you said, an intelligent person or someone capable of critical thought is able to separate those. And maybe it's my own artistic principle that I think as a comic, and we're obviously supposed to be speaking objectively about our observations. That's why the observational comic is that you should be really speaking from outside the whole thing. So for me, it's like if someone is a comic and they do link Muslims to terror, for me it's quite lazy and hack because like more than anybody else, people are coming to a comic as an artist to hear something they've not normally heard all the time. So I feel like if your narrative just represents the same thing people are hearing in like tabloid newspapers or in mainstream media, then it's just lazy. And why do they even need you? Because if you're just saying the same thing they could read in a newspaper or a tabloid, then what difference does it make?
So, see, I was reading an article about this topic actually. It's from about 3 years ago in Post, and it was the top of the article was headlined, when it comes to comedy, is there a line? And there's a paragraph in that article that says that because nowadays everyone's got their phone, everyone's kind of filming everyone doing everything. If I film Dane, for example, at a show, and he makes a joke about something really controversial, so something about sexual abuse, for example, I film that, I put it on Instagram or Facebook, it's a 1 minute clip, it goes viral, Dane's the bad guy. There was a point in this article that was saying that because we're living in that era, this journalist was concerned that that is going to impact on a comic's artistic ability to make jokes about subjects that are sensitive. Is that a concern for you that comics might be scared now to go and push the boundaries in certain areas because of fear of being the bad guy when that one clip goes viral?
I think most creatives, whether they want to admit it or not, are scared of backlash. They're scared to go onto debate shows and say their honest opinion. They're scared to make jokes of their honest opinion. They're scared because we live in a hypersensitive society, and like you said, people are filming it for 1 minute, which means that we, as a receiver of that media, we're getting it with no context. So then we're jumping the gun because we've seen this 1 minute clip and not seen the 25 minutes leading up to that 1 minute. So I think a lot of people are scared, and I think as a comedian, I can tell when you're scared. I can tell when you're making a joke and you're hovering around the line. You don't actually want to deliver the punchline, or you're kind of waiting for the crowd to gear you up. You're waiting for me as someone who bought my ticket to come and watch you to give you the confidence to get to that point. Do you understand? So I think there is a lot of fear around, repercussions and cancelling culture and all of that, which is a shame, but the onus is on the individual, on the comedian, to know that one, I'm funny, and if I'm funny, people are gonna laugh. And two, like Dane was saying, like if you are confident in your joke and know that your intention was not to offend an individual group of people deliberately, then deliver your joke.
A frightened comedian is not a good comedian.
It's not. Nah.
Yeah. And just adding on to say, because I completely agree. Also, for some comedians, like, well, if you wrote it and you know it'd be offensive, then stand by what the fuck you wrote, to be honest with you. And I think that's a big part of it, is that people are now meandering around trying to be popular and stuff like that. And and to escape backlash. And to me, it's like, well, then, like I said, you're not really applying yourself artistically like you could be. And you don't necessarily have to be like, say stuff that's edgy. Not every comic is edgy, not every comic is political, which is absolutely fine. But like you said, if you're gonna say something, then stand by it. Don't like tiptoe around stuff, or really, if you're already molding your comedy or what you're creating to the audience and pandering, then you're better off being a politician. If you want to say stuff that people want to hear, then go be a politician. If you're supposed to be a creative, you're supposed to be saying what you think. And you find, again, and comes from experience, that with most audiences, even if they don't agree with you, that if you can present a joke, which is like an argument, like in a court, in the right way, in a court of public opinion, if you will, then people might be like, I don't agree with necessarily what he's saying, but I respect the fact that he's saying it and he's saying it in this way. Because like I said, I think most people can tell. People can tell if you're being insincere. People can tell if your points are researched. People can tell if you're ignorant, whether you say it or not.
I think people can tell from your delivery in a stand-up situation, but if you're a comedian online, I think sometimes that's where the lines can get blurred. Like I was watching an interview with Little Duval the other day, and he was talking about a joke, well he was challenged on a joke that he made online about retards.
About what?
Retards.
Okay.
So, and he had to take it back. He said,
you can't even use that word anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so he had to delete the tweet, delete all mention of it online. Took a big backlash from. So I think there is also scope for a comedian to say what they like, but learn in that moment if they do get that backlash that actually this is not acceptable.
Yeah. But that's part of the process. I agree. Yeah. But
and I also think that what's happened, maybe that's different to the landscape for comedians than in any other time, is that what's acceptable, and I think we've spoken about it, Sean, what's acceptable and not acceptable is being defined and redefined in real time. So all of that 1 week it might be okay to wear a Trump hat, but next week it's not, for all sorts of reasons. And probably the debate that went on in that week by different people online, schooling themselves, educating themselves, actually being open to different points that they might have had and harboured themselves without actually putting it out there. So I think that the landscape is very, it's a moving,
it's quite fluid
plane at the moment. It's not static at all.
It's very dynamic. But at the same time, I feel like, as I was only speaking from a perspective of a comic, it is dynamic, but what can remain, well, not necessarily, and as an artist, you're supposed to be dynamic in what you're creating anyway, so you're supposed to be evolving yourself. And doesn't necessarily mean that happens at the same speed. But essentially, I think as social nomenclature changes or attitude changes towards things, I think the important thing is maintain your own principles and stuff. There is no, like I said, because of how the social media and the internet has democratized audiences and our eyes and what we can see, then you just find your niche and you find your audience. So some people might not like what you're saying, but I think stick to who you are, then you're gonna meet the audience that have an affinity with what you're saying anyway. But I think a lot of the time it's for any artist, I think no one is universally loved and no one's universally hated. And whether or not you like it, you can try and err on the side of caution and not try and offend some people. Some people will just hate you just for how you look. People can make, so there's enough you can do. People can make a decision about you based on your appearance before you even start, which is why a lot of comics, they open up their set by saying, I know what you're thinking. Because we already know that people already have drawn conclusions about who they think you are based on your appearance.
Who's the modern day Richard Pryor? Who's the comic now that we feel gets it right? Takes risks, but doesn't quite cross that line of taking liberties or, you know what I mean? That was a bit too far. Is there a comic right now that we rate in that way? Oh dear.
I have no idea. I'm going to be silent on this one. I'm going to look to you on this one, Dane.
There's no one out there right now.
I would say, I mean, it's hard to say because it's almost like Richard Pryor began a new school of comedy. So there's so many other people that have been influenced by him, to say that one person, if that makes sense. So rather than just being like a natural successor, he's kind of birthed so many other people as a result. But actually, even Richard Pryor was told by Bill Cosby that he was crossing the line with his material. And it's funny how, someone who was clean on stage and who they, despite their narrative, who they were off stage. So, it kind of helps the point to dovetail that, necessarily what you're saying, because you may be representing an embellished version of yourself, then, Richard Pryor was somebody who cared about animal rights and stuff and, and was a rape victim himself and was outspoken about that. Whereas Bill Cosby, despite his narrative, obviously we're finding out a lot more, he's very different to who he portrayed himself to be on stage. But I'd say the closest for me, I would say would probably be Dave Chappelle. And that's because even Richard Pryor himself said he passed the torch to Chappelle after seeing Chappelle's show. And, I'd say Chappelle's probably the closest in that, he's kind of been prophetic in some of the stuff he's spoken about. And I think he is, he's addressed a lot of issues that some people stay away from. And, and in some respects has attracted a lot of backlash. Especially with some of the recent stuff, he's discussed transgender politics, and obviously he's always discussed race relations, and he's I'd say probably one of the people at the moment. Bill Burr is another one as well.
I like Chris Rock as well.
Chris Rock as well. Yeah, Chris Rock has also addressed it.
Do you think he is?
Early day Chris Rock was much more. Well, actually, I went to see him earlier this year or last year, and he was good.
Yeah,
he
he's still-
touched on
Yeah, he's still
he
on-
touched
yeah,
on
still on
things
point,
that
yeah.
conversations that you know people are uncomfortable
Yeah.
having. But a lot of it was related to his own experience. So,
Yeah, it's personal.
it was
Which I think is always, and that's always the best way. I think the best way, the way for comics or any artist, if you are going to genuinely give an account or you're going to do something which, whether it's offensive or not, if it is from somewhere from a place of honesty and you are being genuine, there's only so much. I mean, why you may incur a backlash, there's only so much you can be affected by it because you can't lie about who you are or your experiences. So